We are now officially recording. We'll kick it off. We're going to be talking to you tonight about funneling and developing a line of logic. The idea behind this is that really it should help as you either continue to refine your review of lit outline, as you start to write your introduction and background, and also as you move into writing your problem statement. So as we go through the presentation, there's going to be some overlap, but what we found when we've done this presentation in the past is that students might connect with one way over another, or hearing it from two different angles really does help provide that foundation. So I'm going to do the first part of our presentation this evening. And so the goals of developing a funnel. So you have probably heard us talk about funneling or creating a funnel many, many times, and now it's really your chance to put this into practice. So it really is the basis of your perspective as well as your entire dissertation. So your funnel should be providing an overview of the topic. It usually does start out from global to a local perspective. It will also help identify a gap in the literature. And my saying is no gap, no study. And sometimes at the early stages of a prospectus, some of you may have identified a study but are not able to substantiate a gap. So we're going to talk about that tonight as well, because that's going to be really important as you move forward in prospectus. And we're also going to talk about how to situate your study in this gap. So how does your study relate to the larger field, and also how does your study relate to the other important works and related topics that are associated with your particular topic. And we're also going to walk you through how to create a storyboard to create that line of logic. So we're going to call this part one, which is going to be what I'm going to go over this evening, is going to be Funneling 101. So many of you probably received an email over the weekend, or maybe even today, from your 790 instructor giving you some tips for review of literature outline and some other important things that are coming up. So topics first. Okay, hold on. I guess I'm having some mic issues.
Capolino, this is Dr. Lee here. You cut out at the beginning of this slide, so you might want to back up just a little bit and start from where you talk about the state and national and global front.
Okay. Thank you. And I'm not sure what's happening on my end, but I show I have a good signal strength. So let's try this again. So again, funneling starts from the very large, broad perspective, and then you're going to slowly bring that and narrow it down. So the funnel really does start at your introduction, and so you're funneling throughout your introduction. You're also funneling in your background and your problem statement. And so that funnel in a chapter one really goes from the broadest point to the narrow point, and that narrow point will end with your purpose and your research questions. That same funnel, but in far more detail, will be expanded in your review of literature. So again, having the funnel right from the beginning is a very, very important part. And those funnels should match, because those funnels create that line of logic. So
Dr. Capolino, it's Dr. Lee again. Your mic cut out again. Can you hear me?
Hold on 1 second, folks. Are you able to hear me now? Okay, great. Okay, we'll see if this works a little bit better. Okay, so I'm sorry, folks. I don't know what's going on with the audio, but Dr. Lee, what point should I start at again this time?
I think you're fine going on because we just caught the tail end of what you said last. So just go on from where you were.
Okay, great. Thank you. So again, you're going to start from the broadest topic. So as you can see, the top prompt in this funnel is really what is happening in the state and national global front that's connected to your particular topic. Okay. Another piece of your funnel should definitely be your theoretical framework. So again, if you're basing your research on any particular theoretical framework, that is something that you're going to want to include in your funnel. And for many of you, this is a part that it still may be emerging in your prospectus. But once you find a theoretical framework, and I'm sure your prospectus teacher will talk to you about that if you haven't, it really does provide the structure for your Chapter 2. Rather than having to pull in all sorts of random topics to kind of form a review of lit, if there's already a framework, theoretical framework behind your study, then it kind of maps it out for you, which is really nice. The next piece is to make sure that you're covering all of the variables or major concepts in your purpose statement, and I'll show you an example of that in just a moment. And then also part of the funnel typically will include something about your sample. So that might be their role, the problems that they're facing in the real world, opportunities, their background, demographics, all of those. And again, that would be specific for your particular study. And ultimately, in your intro and your background and your problem statement, what you're leading to is really substantiating that research gap. That's an important piece. So here's an outline of what that would look like in your Chapter 1, which is essentially your prospectus. So again, typically your introduction is building kind of that suspense for the reader. You know, you might have a catchy opening. You might share some really interesting statistics to kind of hook the reader into your writing. And then as you get into the background, again, that's going to be a little bit more specific than your introduction. And then your problem statement and research gap are really extremely crucial. And that's usually about 5 paragraphs long. But that's really where you're sending the message regarding the sense of urgency. You know, why is this important to study? And you're also really making it clear for the reader what the research gap is. And that leads directly into your purpose statement and research questions. So if you do the funnel correctly, you should be able to read your research questions, purpose statement, and read up, and it should create a line of logic, and you should be able to start at the top at introduction and read down and have it narrow directly to your purpose statement and research questions. So when we talk about alignment, that is definitely a key piece, but also within alignment, and I worked with some of my students on this during the colloquium, is using the same vocabulary is important too. So for example, my dissertation was on, site administrators. Well, in my introduction, if I call them site administrators, I should probably call them site administrators throughout. I shouldn't say site administrators in introduction, then call them principals in the background, then call them school leaders in the problem statement, and then change it all up in my purpose and research questions. So that's something I would recommend for everyone to do, is some of those frequent words that you're going to be using as you write, make sure that you're using them consistently. So that way the alignment is extremely clear for the reader. So again, one of the pieces that should be included in your funnel are the major variables and major concepts. So this is just a little snapshot of a synthesis matrix. And again, that's the last assignment you're going to be doing in this class. So some of you may have already started this. Others may be saving it till the end. I would recommend that you work on this throughout. It'll make it a lot easier than trying to put together a synthesis matrix at the very end. But it will also really make it very clear to you what are those common themes and variables, and then make sure that those themes and variables reflect themselves in your funnel, which, again, your funnel is ultimately your review of literature outline. So again, I just took samples from my own dissertation. It's the dissertation I know the best. And you can see across the top I have several different variables and major concepts. And if you were to go look at my table of contents in my dissertation, you would see there's a subheading for every single one of those items listed across the top. So when you create your synthesis matrix, you're going to find that the same should hold true. Anything that's so important enough to actually be a variable or a major concept and be listed on your synthesis matrix will also turn into a subheading in your funnel and ultimately in your review of lit. So this is just taking it a step further. So here's a purpose of the study. And so again, if I go back to what we said at the beginning, is you want to make sure that anything that is represented in your purpose is also represented in your funnel and your review of lit outline. So you can see by this purpose statement, everything that I have highlighted in blue is going to end up being a subheading in my review of lit, but it's also going to be covered as part of my funnel. So I would introduce all of these items in my introduction and background. Again, a brief overview. But then when I go to write my chapter 2, which is going to be, I like to call it the expanded funnel, you really are going to go into each of these particular subheadings with far more depth. So for example, in my background section, when I'm talking about vision, school culture, management, collaboration, ethics, community advocating, in my background, I might mention those with perhaps a paragraph each. In my review of lit, that might expand to 2 to 3 pages each, because those are key variables of my study. Does that make sense? I'll stop there for just a second to see if anyone has any questions. And Dina, it looks like you asked me a question, but I didn't see exactly when that popped up. So does it need to be identical to this one? Can you tell me what you're referring to? Was it the outline?
Kathleen, it was
okay.
the synthesis matrix.
Okay, great. And I see you answered that for her. Great, thank you. So in terms of the synthesis matrix, again, we don't ask for overly complicated synthesis matrix. I know some of our alphas basically did an annotated bibliography as a synthesis matrix, but that's not really necessary. If that's something you want to do to organize your work, that's great. But in terms of what we're requiring in the prospectus, the sample I showed you would suffice, but of course you're going to have a much longer list of literature on that left-hand column. Okay, so Robert is asking, the intro is 1 to 2 pages. That is a short landing pad for a wide funnel. Am I correct? Right, Robert. That's really just kind of the overarching, get the reader hooked into your study, and then you're going to go into more detail. So there is some suspense in that first 1 to 2 pages. You're not trying to throw everything into your introduction so that the reader knows, you know, what's going to be coming up next, but it's building that foundation. Lucy is asking, can we use the same format for the synthesis matrix Dr. Guy White showed? I did not see exactly what he used, but I believe the EDD team is using a specific format for that, but I'll let Dr. Lee chime in on that. Can you answer that question?
Actually, I'm going to ask Dr. White. I think there's a sample synthesis matrix in the shell somewhere. Is that right, Dr. White?
Yes, we have several different examples, and we haven't prescribed one version over another. So I would work with your instructor for 790, and if you want to show that instructor what you want to use, then if he or she approves it, then we'll be able to go with that. But we haven't prescribed one single format. You can use various examples. However, there are some formats that don't work. So that's why I say go to your instructor and make sure that whatever you want to use is going to be workable with that instructor.
Great. Thank you, Dr. White. I will just make one comment that we had learned from in the past is that those students that try to use an Excel spreadsheet, although that's a great way to organize information, it does become problematic later on trying to get an Excel spreadsheet to format correctly in a Word document when you put it in your dissertation. So we usually do suggest that you do it as a Word table rather than a spreadsheet. So that way when you or your editor merge those documents in your dissertation, it's far less problematic. All right. Moving on. I'm going to talk just briefly about the research gap. Dr. Lee is going to really show you a fantastic way to take a look and find the gap for your particular study. But this is really an important piece. And I think some of you probably have a fairly good idea about the gap, and others are still trying to find it. But again, without the research gap, you really do not have a study. So this is one table that I like to use with my students to kind of help guide them into identifying a gap. And so there's a couple ways to do it. One way that you cannot do it is just by saying, I can't find any literature on my topic. That does not constitute a gap. So, that's a good start. That's a good indicator that there may be a gap, but you need to substantiate the gap. And so here's a couple ways to do it. The first one is you might be able to find authors who recommend additional research on your exact proposed topic. So when we have recommended in the past for you to take a look at published dissertations and research articles and then go take a look at their recommendations for future study, that is what we're talking about. So are there authors who have specifically said there needs to be more research on this topic? Second way is you may find similar studies, but you can't find an exact study conducted with your proposed population or geographical location, or there may be some other slight, variable, switched that you would like to look at. So again, finding similar studies is one way to help substantiate the gap. And then the last way to kind of take a look at it is, again, can you find research that's related to your study that you can build on and that you can build on further? So maybe someone did a very, first study of its kind on a particular topic, and maybe your study is just building upon that. So you may not have a lot of other authors that have recommended studies on that yet, but this particular, author you want to build on their research has suggested it. So again, those are three ways to kind of, as you're reading through the literature, to keep in mind, because again, at the tail end of your problem statement, you are going to need to make it very clear for the reader what your research gap is. And in that narrative, you will likely, again, cite authors that have recommended research or similar studies, or a study that you plan to build upon, or a combination of all three. So we have a question down in the chat box about how many studies should we use to make the case. Well, again, every topic is going to be a little bit different. For example, my dissertation topic, there is only one author doing any research in my exact topic, so there was only one author that was recommending additional research on my topic. Okay, but depending on your topic, you might have 5 authors recommending additional research. Again, in my case, I was able to list numerous studies that were similar studies, but they were all conducted with teachers instead of administrators. So again, it's going to depend on your particular topic, but you need to make sure that you can substantiate the gap, and this is one way to kind of look at it. And again, Dr. Lee is going to share with you another way and some great visuals that I think will really make this concept stand out in your mind. Again, sorry, when we use PowerPoint, it does like shift some of the formatting a bit here, but here is what the Review of Lit Chapter 2 funnel could look like. And so the color coding on this slide, and again, I'm sorry for the formatting, it does throw it off a bit, but what I did, again, this is my study, everything that is not bolded really is what I focused on in my intro and background. I may have touched upon the items that are in bold, but for the most part, I talked about what was not in bold, and then when I went to Chapter 2, again, the expanded funnel, I went far more in depth on the history of school administration. I went far more into depth in each of the 6 standards, which served as my theoretical framework. And I also went far more into depth regarding California administrator profiles such as gender, ethnicity, and education level. So you can see, you know, a lot of what I added, the bold information, was far more detailed than some of the overarching concepts. So again, introduce everything in your introduction and background for Chapter 1, but really go into depth and detail in your review of Lit. Does that make sense? And again, thank you to my colleagues who are answering down in the chat box. I appreciate that. Thank you, Dr. Hightower, for that last one. Okay, great. All right. So now we're going to just pause here for a moment and give you a few minutes to give this a try. But most of you, if not all of you, should have written a literature outline. That is one of the assignments in the course. If you have that handy, could you please take that out and give it a good second look? And based on the information you just heard, is there anything you think you need to revise or possibly write notes on that you might need to change on that outline? So again, that literature outline you're creating really is going to serve as the backbone for your Chapter 2, but those are the same topics that you should be discussing in your intro and background, just not in as much depth. So we're going to give you just a couple minutes here to do that, and then I will turn it over to Dr. Lee to do the second half of the webinar. Okay, we just wanted to give you a couple brief minutes to write down any additional thoughts. I'm sure some of you probably realize that you might want to add a few things to your outline. Again, this is a process. You will probably continuously change that outline throughout your entire dissertation. But again, if you really get a solid start, it's going to be very helpful to you. So Fran asked a question, do the variables ultimately become pieces of the theoretical framework? Often, Fran, the variables are part of the theoretical framework from the beginning, and that's why they're chosen. I'm not sure if that clarifies for you, but. And Dr. Lee reminded me I actually do have a few more slides, so it's not his turn to talk yet. So let me just go over a couple more tips on, now that we've passed the funnel, about the introduction and background real quick. Rita's asking, is it possible to have more than one theory? Yes, it absolutely is possible to have your study based on more than one theory. Okay, so the introduction, again, some of this I may have already talked about, but so I'll go over this fast. But again, for the introduction, again, you're setting the stage for your prospectus and really introduces the reader to the context of the problem. So again, you want it to be a little bit of suspense and mystery and not tell them everything, but you certainly want them from the very beginning to understand what the context for the problem is. Now, if you haven't given any thought to what the problem is, that's something I would start thinking about. You know, how would you frame that? And to me, the problem statement is really, in some ways, your elevator speech for your dissertation. So if you had, you know, someone in the elevator who's going to give you $10,000 grant to study something, what would you say in that 2-minute speech to convince them that your, you know, subject matter was, you know, worthy of study, that there was a gap, that there was a sense of urgency? So think about that as you start writing your introduction. So your introduction will start global and systematically move through the funnel. But again, you have quite a number of pages to build this foundation, so don't move too quickly. You don't want to throw everything in your introduction, because then there won't be anything to write in your background. So that's why it's really important to kind of funnel out and outline this on paper before you start your writing. Okay? And then you will mention, but not necessarily go into any sort of depth, those variables or topics or subtopics that form the foundation of your study. But again, those will be expanded in your background. Okay. So, just a few more tips, and again, most of these I've already mentioned before. Just like if you're reading a good novel, a good magazine, you know, you really need to pay attention to how to hook the reader. And often if you can make, you know, some bold statements or statistics, now of course they need to be validated, but that's also a good way to get people to want to read more about your study. Okay? For the background, again, whatever you listed in your funnel is going to be mentioned in your background, but will not be thoroughly described until you actually write your chapter 2. So one way, and I know there's, Dr. Lee and I talked about, there's so much we could have shared with you. A lot of it has to do with writing tips. But when you are writing your introduction, background, review of lit, now is really the time to think carefully about level headings as well, because that's how you can show depth in your study. So if you're used to writing just with level 1 and level 2, you will, in your review of lit, when you get to writing chapter 2, probably be using far more level headings in order to really show the depth and how all of these topics and subtopics and how all these headings relate to each other. Okay, problem statement. And again, you won't have your problem statement due for a little while, but honestly, if you can't make a convincing case that there's a problem, then you won't have a study. So again, start thinking about this now. But as you build that funnel, also think about it as at the tail end, again, you're building the argument for the study. So there has to be a problem. There has to be some sense of urgency. You need to convince the reader of its importance, and it has to end with a research gap. That is absolutely key. So keep looking for that gap if you are not able to substantiate it. Because if you write, again, you know, the gap in the literature is I can't find anything on this topic, that is not a gap. So a couple problem statement tips, and again, we'll send you this PowerPoint so you can refer to it when you're writing your problem statement. Or I think you might actually have a similar version of this presentation already in the course. But again, problem statement is a good place to really talk about opposing viewpoints of authors, because that kind of sets that stage for, you know, this author says this, but these authors say this, and, you know, that kind of conflict creates, you know, the problem, why you need to come in and research this further. The last paragraph should clearly illustrate the gap in the literature. And again, if there's no research, you cannot just say there is no research. So if that's where you're at right now with your topic, you're going to have to dig deeper before you write your problem statement. Okay, so now I will turn it over to Dr. Lee. But before he jumps on, any final questions on the first part of the webinar? Again, if any of you would like to, you know more about any of these topics, we'd be happy to share it with you. But again, your prospectus teachers, instructors are all fabulous, experienced chairs and can go into more depth with any of these topics with you as well. But again, thank you for your attention, and I will turn it over to Dr. Lee.
All right, thank you. Let's give her a round of applause, huh? I'm going to take over and talk to you about funneling and developing a line of logic from a slightly different angle. And although some of the tips that we may focus on may be particular to a certain section of your prospectus paper, such as the background, purpose statement, lit review, significance of the study, etc., I want to encourage you to think about the approach being virtually the same. Okay, so how you go about developing a line of logic directly impacts your background statement, your problem statement, your literature review outline, and basically all aspects of the 790 paper. I also want to encourage you tonight to type comments and questions in the chat box. And I'll ask the EDT faculty to help monitor the chat box. And so Dr. Capolino mentioned earlier that tonight we'll offer a few different ways to look at the funnel and the developing a line of logic process. So here's another perspective, okay? I want to start off by using a textbook that you guys already have, the Roberts book, and I understand it's become quite a popular book, especially with the Star Wars folks. So the dissertation journey, the Roberts book, you don't have to take it out now, but one of the most helpful pages in the book is page 109. I think it's 108 and 109. There's a checklist of things related to how to write a literature review. And on that checklist is some language that talks about proportionality. And I love how Roberts talks about proportionality here. Okay, so she says at least 3/4 of the review focuses on variables or concepts identified in the purpose statement and research question. Okay, the remaining 1/4 sets the study. Oh, here we go. The remaining 1/4 sets the stage and gives the big picture and background of your study. Okay, so let me talk first about the 3/4 portion of your literature review, right? So here's where you talk about the big variables of your study. It's where you funnel from the global down to the local. You talk about the components of the theoretical framework. Part of your approach to talking about these big variables is this idea that you need to talk about not just the variables, but the related variables, right? So leadership might have synonyms such as mentoring or coaching. So you want to kind of delve into the various related topics in addition to the main topics of your study. And so by doing this, in the first 3/4 of your review of literature, Roberts basically says that creates a foundation for the last 1/4 of your review of literature, and that then becomes the foundation of your study. More or less, it is a way to situate your study. Okay, so I'm going to take you through an example of this. And in this example, we're actually going to take a field trip, and I'm going to take you to a place halfway around the world. And this is an example that takes place in Nepal. And I did a study back in 2013. And I looked at teacher training with technology integration in Nepal. So if you don't know much about Nepal, it's a very mystical country. It's sandwiched between two of Asia's superpowers, India and China. I think most famous is Mount Everest, which all of us have heard of before. But it's a place that's rich in culture. I know that when I'm there, time slows down and you just get lost in the rich culture of that region. Most communities are farming communities, and it's kind of a secluded piece of the world. However, in recent times, the Nepalese have leapfrogged into the 21st century, and what I mean by that is many Nepalese have never used a film camera and are using digital cameras, right? So they're using modern technology without really using some of the previous generations of that technology. So I'm interested in how technology is used in rural villages, specifically in education. And so this 2013 study focused on how teachers in rural villages are integrating technology into their teaching, and more specifically, what is being done to train teachers on this topic of technology integration. So to set up for this study, I needed to deeply understand the literature that surrounds my study, you see. So I basically took out a blank piece of paper and I listed all of the major variables related to my study. Variables or keywords, however you want to look at it, but I created essentially a table of these keywords. And I went to, of all places, the university library, and I started searching in ProQuest what the landscape of that literature looks like. And let me just show you what it looks like. So I looked at the major variables, education, technology, teacher training, ICT, and you can see that, you know, for some of these individual variables, some of these topics have well over 1 million peer-reviewed articles. Technology has 855,000 articles. And so that's a lot to cover, but I need to cover it in order to set the foundation for my study. And if you look at the frequency column, doesn't that work out nicely? That starts to take place, takes shape of literally a funnel, because as you get down to the middle part of the funnel and you start playing around with combinations of words, right? So Nepal yielded 7,631 articles, but if you say Nepal in education, that quickly funnels down to 809 peer-reviewed articles, right? And so what I've highlighted here for you is the top portion being the 3/4 of the review that focuses on the variables or a few combinations of variables, which then sets the foundation for that last 1/4 of your funnel, which are studies that I would consider are most like yours, right? And so that last 1/4, and you can kind of tell, I'm adding 3 words together in my searches: Nepal Education and Technology, 41 articles; Nepal Education ICT, 1 article; Nepal Teacher Training and Technology, 0, and Nepal Teacher Training and ICT, 0. Okay, so this is an interesting phenomenon, is the 0 phenomenon. And you know, Dr. Capolino earlier said, well, there's nothing out there. That's kind of getting you there, but it's not exactly what we're looking for. So I'm going to actually show you next. Actually, let me pause and say another thing this table highlights is the potential gap, which is where the zeros are. And just around that potential gap are, you probably have heard many of your 790 instructors talk about the heavy hitters, right? Who are the experts in the field who are researching topics that are like yours, that are most like yours, I should say. And I would say the bottom part of the funnel is where the heavy hitters literature is typically found. Okay, so I'm going to show you what it means to develop a line of logic based on that whole table and funneling process. And this is actually part of a paper that was published. And so the first thing I did in my storyboarding is to talk about how Nepal in Education and Technology, and although there were 41 articles, I basically synthesized and reported out this idea that basically these 41 articles are on education and computer science education in Nepal, and not really this idea of teachers integrating technology in Nepal. So although it's 41, it's not quite exactly what I'm doing my study on. Next, I said Nepal in Education and ICT yielded 1 hit, and this is actually a landmark study in Nepal. The reason it's a landmark study is because it's a study done on the 1 laptop per child program in Nepal, and this is really an education-focused article. So I talked a little bit about this one article leading up to my study, okay? But notice this third bullet point here, and this is where the funnel gets down to the 0. And I talk about how Nepal plus teacher training plus technology and Nepal plus teacher training and ICT should have yielded proper peer-reviewed articles related to my study. However, the evidence revealed that there are 0 results, 0 results. So what I want to do is show you how to talk about nothing. And that really sounds like a funny way to go about it, but I'm going to show you how to talk about nothing, okay? So here's how you talk about 0 results. And imagine a kaleidoscope where if you're looking through the lens of a kaleidoscope and you're turning it, there are shapes and sizes and colors around the outside that keep changing. However, when you look down the narrow center of the kaleidoscope, there's nothing there. And in fact, you can see all the way through, and you can see the light at the other end of the kaleidoscope. And so when you describe nothing, you actually need to describe the literature that surrounds that nothing. You see, you talk about the experts' research on the topics that are most like yours, okay? So again, this is that last part of the funnel, that last 25% that Roberts talks about. And when you talk about the articles that surround your study, and even though no one's done anything like yours before, it begins to take shape, and you begin to do what I call situating your study. Okay, so I'll pull some more language from the article that was published just to highlight a few things. So to talk about nothing, meaning Nepal, I needed to zoom out a little bit and talk about what research has been done on other developing countries. So when I talk about other developing countries, this is that connection to that, global versus local perspective, right? So if I drill down to the local, nothing's been done in Nepal. However, if I back up a little bit and talk about the global, now certain research studies are beginning to emerge. And so one study that I cited was a study that happened in Cambodia, and the study talked about how online distance learning is helping supplement face-to-face education. So I talk about how in Southeast Asia there's beginning to be some momentum built around this idea of using technology in education. I'll talk a little bit later about this concept of emphasizing relatedness, but just keep that in mind. Okay. I also talked about a study done in Jordan, and I talked about how this is a trend. It's a trend happening in other developing countries, and how this particular study by Ahmed is a landmark study because it's the first one that talked about integrating technology into curriculum in developing countries. So I can begin to make some claims, you see, during this process, and by saying that it's a landmark study, the thing that I'm doing here is, again, that idea of situating my study. Okay, some more language that situates my study. Some literature is beginning to emerge in the area of developing countries, and this points to the need for research to be done in Nepal in the area of teacher training with technology. So again, that gap in the literature is just not nothing, but it's really this idea of nothing situated by studies that are being done in other contexts, if you will, studies that are done by other experts in the field, although nothing has really been done in Nepal. Okay, so I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions in the chat box. So any questions on how to get at that 0? Nothing has ever been done. Does that help? Okay. Let me just go on then and say that when you begin to talk about surrounding studies, you're talking about the gap in the literature, right? So now you can start painting that picture of the landscape of your study. You can start painting that picture of what studies have been done and really positioning your study in the greater context of what other studies have been done on the topic. And thus, you begin to identify this gap in the literature. Okay, so next, we're going to do a quick exercise. I'll give you just a few minutes to do this. And so I'd like to give you an opportunity to map out what that nothing looks like. And literally what I want you to do is take out a blank piece of paper and draw a mind map, a bubble map, if you will. Draw a circle, that's your study in the middle, and start drawing lines to peripheral other circles, and those other circles represent studies that are most like yours, and keep these 3 questions in mind. What are the related topics to your study? What does research say, and how does that literature situate your study? And where is the gap in the literature? So based on your recollection of the literature that you have read, can you draw a bubble map of studies that are around yours so that you can begin to describe that 0, describe that nothing has ever been done like this before? Okay, I'll give you about 2 minutes just to sketch out a bubble map of what that looks like as it relates to your study. This. Okay, you can continue doing this on your own, but I want to go back to this table. So making a table like this and jumping in the databases and looking at the frequency count, this is really a quick and easy way to start understanding what the shape of that funnel looks like. And if you discover that the bottom part of your funnel really has large numbers, then the aha moment there is, wow, lots of people are studying my topic. And so you may be studying a topic that's been overly researched, or you may need to do more refining, as Dr. Capolino had said earlier, maybe change the context of what you're doing. So if it's a study done on K-12 education, has that study been done in higher education or the corporate world or even government? Okay, so start changing the context of the way you look at it too. This is really a quick and easy way to kind of map out the shape of that funnel and what the variables look like as you're studying. I would, Fran, that's a good question. I would try to keep it within the last 5 years, but if it's a really specific topic that has not been well researched, you may need to look further back. And so for my work, I'm having to look back in the 1980s for literature, and that's like over 2.5, 3 decades ago. But the literature on how Nepalese education works really starts in the early women's literacy days. And so you may have to go back a little bit further, and again, that's really depending on your topic. Okay. So I want to transition to some writing tips on how, and I think writing tips really make sense here to talk about, because we talked about the what, and the writing tips really focus on the how. How are you going to do this, right? So a couple of tips here. In addition to quoting sources, we would like to see you synthesize ideas and even paraphrase, okay? And I think it's just easier to quote sources, but what ends up happening is you don't have the luxury of quoting all the authors, and so what you need to do is begin to synthesize what they say in a condensed kind of a way, especially for a paper like the prospectus paper. Otherwise, you end up writing, 5 times as much as what you need to write for the prospectus paper just to get your point across. Okay. There's a couple of sections in the APA manual out of Chapter 3 that has some very valuable writing tips. Chapter 3, 3.05, continuity and presentation of ideas. And in this section, we talk about things like, not to be so jumpy from one idea to the next, using transitions, right? Transitions between ideas, transitions within paragraphs, and also transitions from paragraphs to paragraphs. Smoothness and expression, tone, economy of expression, and also precision and clarity. Those writing tips really go a long way in the prospectus paper, and so I'd encourage you to take out your APA manual and look at those sections in Chapter 3. Okay. All right, so some more suggestions on synthesizing literature. Okay, so let's look at the left column. The left column says the degree of certainty. So if something is almost absolutely certain in the literature, a sample expression might be something like this: the results of extensive experimental research leads to the firm conclusion that ... Okay? Or evidence from all major studies overwhelmingly support the conclusion that ... So this is where, if you're reading the peer-reviewed articles and you get to the bottom 25% of that funnel, and these are studies that are most like yours, you can start making some broad statements like this and synthesize the literature in a way that really is concise and to the point. The next degree of certainty, close to certain, here's a sample expression: the body of literature on XYZ topic strongly indicates the following conclusion. Strongly indicates meaning it's not 100%, but most experts would agree that this is the conclusion. Okay. The next degree of clarity, certainty, a fair degree of certainty. The 4 studies to date confirms the major premise of ABC theory, pointing to the validity of the theory. This conclusion should be tempered by the limited number of studies. So it's a fair degree of certainty, but we're saying here that not a lot of work has been done on this topic. However, what's been done leads to a fair degree of certainty. Okay, rather certain, the inconsistencies in the results of the studies on this topic make researching from conclusions problematic, right? Still, the best of studies seem to suggest that ... Okay? And lastly, very uncertain, and this is where, you might have experts that are split on a viewpoint on a topic. Some very preliminary evidence offered by pilot studies leads us to the very tentative conclusion that ... Okay, so here are some literally some sentence starters, and what I want to do is give you guys an opportunity to practice, and you can literally pick one of these sentence starters and finish the sentence with based on some of the literature that you have come across. And I think the more you practice this kind of stuff, the better you get at it. So let me give you 2 minutes, just paper and pencil. Practice synthesizing some of the literature that you have come across, and I'll chime back in about 2 minutes. Okay? Okay, about 1 more minute. Okay, so let me touch on something that Dr. White mentioned. You need to cite your sources for these statements and not just make them. And, you know, if you don't cite, it starts to sound like your opinion, and your opinion is actually not okay in this kind of a writing. It's really evidencing what's out there in the literature. So although it sounds opinionated, right, some of these sentence starters, it really is a sentence starter that allows you to pull in the facts to substantiate your statement. So again, practice, practice, practice. Synthesize the literature, don't just quote. Okay, almost done here. Critique rather than just report out on literature. This is important because this is your way to develop your doctoral voice, right? And again, it's not your opinion, but it's your synthesis of ideas based on facts. And I want to encourage you to think a little bit differently about this kind of writing. You don't sound like an expert. You are the expert. And I would say at the end of the day, this is your way of making big changes in the world, right? It's to do the research and get it published. And so keep that in mind. Critique rather than just report on literature as a way to develop your doctoral voice. Okay. Last slide here. More writing tips. Come up with a game plan. Storyboard your line of logic. I showed it to you in text form. Okay, but really just, you know, go to Google, go to images, and download like a storyboarding template, and just map out like the storyline you're trying to develop. You hear a lot of us talk about the line of logic, but map it out. What is that line of logic? What is your thinking from idea A to B to C all the way downstream? Okay. And I love this picture on the right. Focus on the gap in the literature and leverage the literature to situate your study. So, you know, it's this idea that you don't just say nothing's been done. You say nothing's been done, but here's what's been done around my topic as a way to really identify the gap and situate your study. Okay. So thank you, everyone. I hope that was helpful. And I think we have just a few minutes for questions and answers, I think. And if you have any questions, go ahead and type in the chat box. Let's take maybe just 2 minutes for Q&A, and then we'll wrap up. Any questions? Last week, yes. The bottom of the funnel begins to shape your study. All right, then. Dr. Capolino, any last words?
Nope, just good luck to all of you on your prospectus, and we're here to support you. So, again, thank you for attending this evening, and we'll be sending out the recording.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Have a good night.